Well, thank you. Jess, it's nice to be welcomed anywhere with a round of applause. I like that. Can you please do that again? Well, thank you. I can't believe you did that because Simon didn't say to do that time. No, we're here today at the fabulous Wheeler Centre in Naarm, Melbourne. My name is Tarang Chawla. I'm an advocate against men's violence following the murder of my younger sister, Nikki, and I'm joined by Jess Hill here today, who's written quite a phenomenal piece, the new quarterly essay, Losing It, Can We Stop Violence Against Women and Children? I'll introduce Jess in just a moment. Before I do, I would like to acknowledge that we're meeting today on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which this event is taking place. I also want to acknowledge any First Nations people who are here with us in the room today and pay my respects to elders past and present. And also, Jess, if I may, on our behalf, acknowledge that the statistics that you refer to in your quarterly essay and that those from the sector or with lived experience here today will know, or even our listeners after the fact will know, that First Nations women in particular and First Nations children are disproportionately impacted by men's violence. And that's not at the hands solely of by Aboriginal men. That is an ongoing impact of colonisation and dispossession of land and cultures, and it's imperative that we honour and recognise that here this evening. I also want to acknowledge that this evening's event will include references to sexual abuse, assault and men's violence against women. If you do require support relating to these topics, there are a number of services listed on the event page of the Wheeler Centre website where you can learn more and seek advice or support as necessary. And also, if you do need to step out of the room today, if anything is triggering for you, you will not offend Jess or myself. Please do what you need to do to look after yourself and practice self-care. So, that's the formalities out of the way. Jess, you've written this essay, Losing It, Can We Stop Violence Against Women and Children? And as I introduce you, I've written down that, Jess, men's violence against women has increasingly come under the spotlight with the fact that while the overall homicide rate has trended downwards, intimate partner homicide has increased. And for those here today, for you, Jess, this is something that you care about very deeply. And you may care about this issue because you are someone with lived experience, or you come to this work having lost a loved one or a family member, or you may be someone who is from the community and cares that this is an issue that robs victims and their families of their dignity and their human rights. Or you may be someone who's also a victim survivor who happens to work within the sector. Whatever brings you here today, there's so much to cover and so much to discuss. So I'd like to, without further ado, introduce today's guest, Jess Hill. Jess. You are widely regarded as one of Australia's most fearless investigative journalists. You wrote the Stellar Prize-winning book, See What You Made Me Do, which reshaped the national conversation on both coercive control and domestic abuse. In your latest quarterly essay, Losing It, Can We Stop Violence Against Women and Children? You challenge governments, prevention agencies, and all of us to confront the realities of a crisis that sadly is only getting worse, not better. So tonight, I'm hoping that we can unpack some of the causes of this violence and the issue, the backlash, and perhaps most importantly, discuss what real solutions actually look like. Welcome, Jess.
Thanks, Tarang.
Jess, I was quite lucky. I got an advanced copy of the essay in order to actually be able to discuss it with you today, which had many people that I know within the sector sort of emailing me or sending me messages. My iPhone would be kind of, doing the little ding ding thing at 10 p.m. at night, just being like, what do you think? Do you mind sending me a copy? And thankfully, your publicist did things the analog way, so I couldn't actually send it. It was like like an Officeworks type bound book that I got. And I was reading it and furiously writing notes, but I thought for today I'll bring a brand new copy along that hopefully you'll sign for me at the book signing after this. But you speak about the national plan, which promises to end violence in one generation. Now, is this a realistic goal, and are we on track? Are we making progress, or is it just political rhetoric? Where do you stand on this?
Well, so there's a lot to digest from how you've opened, Tarang, and the first thing I would just say is just to honour and acknowledge Nikki and the 10 years since you lost her love and her life, and centre her and other victim survivors, both living and dead, in our discussion, because they're the people and their families and their friends and their loved ones who are at the centre of everything that we do, and that's the centre of gravity for this conversation. So, is it achievable? Well, in the past, I kind of made references to it being Orwellian, and that making this kind of promise has the effect of destroying language, because it's like that thing, that political promises that get made that mean that words become meaningless because actually it's completely unachievable. However, to draw back from that sour analysis, I would say that, so, you know, Bob Hawke said no child would live in poverty by 1990. And while that was possibly not the right promise to make at the time, it actually did drive some pretty massive policy changes. It was not just an empty promise that he kind of like put on the floor like a cat turd and just left there. It was something that really animated his government. And what I've come to think is that there's two approaches to this. One is that if we say we're going to end it in a single generation, we're kind of invisibilising the intergenerational transmission of violence, which is not great. The second part of it, though, is that, wow, if every government has committed to ending this within a single generation, you'd be wanting to marshal some real resources towards doing that, and you probably want to redirect a whole lot of funding into various areas, and you'd want to be putting your best brains on that project. You'd want to be getting the various ministries from health to housing to treasury all working together on this nation building, project. So I'm happy to leverage that completely unrealistic promise, and say, you committed that, you bought it, you own it. Let's do that. Sure. Why not?
As we walk out of this space, Jess, either the Prime Minister or the Treasurer will be getting up to deliver their budget speech, right? And you've talked about redirecting funding. What do you think we'll see in this budget or in the upcoming election as it relates to the prevention of violence against women? Is this going to be a priority on the national agenda as it has been in previous elections where it's been spoken about? Or is this the election where, following, the election of President Trump in the United States and the backlash and resistance to diversity, equity, and inclusion and gender equality as part of that, that we are going to see a complete sort of denial of this issue from two prospective male leaders of the country, in an election just coming up? Where do you sit on that? Is that what's going to happen?
Well, fortune telling is always a very difficult sort of occupation, and also when your fortune's going to be told like tomorrow, and I'd be proven wrong so quickly before this even goes up on YouTube. So one thing I would say is that, and I write about this in the essay, that, as you say, we're sort of in the jaws of backlash, right? And where it's like, this is a very bad analogy, but when the Kardashians were massive in the United States and they sort of took a while to come here, everything does that. It's like we sort of get this like backwash, and we're getting like the backwash of backlash that's been really in place overseas for quite some time. Maybe because they're asleep and we're awake. I don't know. It just takes a while to get here. So we're in the jaws of that, but it's not as febrile as it is in the United States. It's kind of like an echo of it. And I would say, to credit the Albanese government, they have like some of their major policies that they're going to the election with, like sort of quasi-ish universal childcare, women's health. They're not just responding to the polling analysts who are saying your problem now is grumpy men. Your asset last election was grumpy women. They kind of helped sweep you to power along with the independents. Now your problem is grumpy men. I don't see them sort of like taking the bait and just switching in a totally politically shallow way. But I don't think that I would be surprised if we see something game-changing in this budget, because all along it's been a pretty conservative march up to the election, right? Both of them are doing the kind of, we'll do that too. You know, it's all like trying to erase difference. Interestingly, the coalition, and I've heard this from many people who work in the sector and adjacent, particularly in the children and young people's area, the coalition is like very into stuff around children and young people. Not so much about avoiding putting them in jail, but like... But this stuff around child sex abuse and child abuse generally, it animates the coalition in ways that can also be leveraged because ultimately I have my own political opinions, and I'm sure you do too, Tarang.
Not today.
Not today, no. We're not apolitical people, but yes, for the purposes of actually just getting shit done, I'm not partisan in this approach. Anyone who's going to work with us to do this in a way that's not harmful, like, great, I'm on side. But yeah, so I think... I don't think you're going to get much gendered analysis from the coalition, but I don't get the sense that the Albanese government's just going to sell out women and kids.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing that. I want to take it back to something that I took from reading this quarterly essay, and also your white paper, Rethinking Primary Prevention, which you co-authored with Professor Mike Salter, and we were discussing before, almost a year ago now was when that came out, or just about a year ago. And so it's been quite a whirlwind time since. And I feel it'd be fair to say you're critical of the current prevention model and in part Our Watch's role in that. What's missing from that perspective? Is it the change the story framework that you have issues with? Is it Our Watch as a whole? In Victoria, there is a sense that there is a prevention of family violence. There has been, for at least a decade now. We had the Royal Commission into the prevention of family violence here. So the prevention landscape is perhaps a little bit different in Victoria than other parts of the country. And so, in reading this, I wanted to get straight from you, like what's missing in the prevention framework as you see it, and what needs to be there? Yeah.
So first of all, I just say that my beef is not with any particular agency. I don't have a problem with any particular group of people or individuals. I think what I wanted to do with this was just to critically assess where we've come from, where we're going, how successful have we been, which we should do for any major policy area, and particularly when the stakes are so high and we're literally dealing with people's lives. But also, I want to acknowledge two things. And one is that, Our Watch, when it came on the scene, it was enormously supportive of journalists who are working in this area, including myself. When I first started reporting in this area, I won a whole bunch of their awards, and this is not to blow smoke up my own arse. I'm really not trying to do that, but I'm just saying, like, that encouragement was fundamental to me continuing to work in this area. Now, they may want to take those awards back now. Anyway, you can't, because they're in my office. You can't have them.
How many of those did you win out of interest, the Our Watch Awards? 3.
Wow. And that was like the first 3 awards I ever won in my life. So it was quite impactful. My mum cried. Anyway, but also, when we first started out, and the national plan in 2010 predates Change the Story, but it's sort of like it's a trajectory that runs from Vic Health, and I won't go back all into the weeds of that, but really it's a trajectory that comes from that 2010 national plan. And this was like a really bold thing to step out and do, to say that we are going to be the first country in the world to centre prevention, and we are going to try to change the social conditions in which gendered violence occurs, that support gendered violence occurring. And the national plan, originally brainchild of Tanya Plibersek, amazing, incredible thing to have happened, changed the story, came with a lot of fanfare and a lot of hope. And it was, at first, when we see reporting on this in the early years of it, it was talked about that this is a hypothesis. It's a hypothesis not because it's not based on any evidence. It was, of course, based on evidence, but it had not been a proven thing. We had not seen another country change the social conditions under government-funded initiatives, you know, like you could say the Nordic countries did that, but it was like an organic process that happened, you know, semi-organic from the 1970s onwards. So this was going to be a government-funded and almost government-directed by, you know, by their agencies to change these social conditions. Fucking fantastic. Like, what an incredibly bold and ambitious thing to set out on. And when we set out on that in 2010, we were pretty confident that by 2019 we see violence starting to go down, and that we'd see fewer kids living in domestic violence. Now, when that didn't happen, and we didn't really see rates of violence go down, then it was sort of kicked out into the long grass. And 2019 for me is a bit of a turning point. I was sceptical about our ability to change attitudes and whether if we change attitudes that would lead to change behaviours, because I've been, you know, married to a psychotherapist for a long time, and I know how difficult it is to change behaviours through like cognitive means, and how deeply embedded those schemas are, and seeing how long it takes. So I was sceptical of that, but I've got to say, I guess I was deeply offended as someone who was working in this area when government was able to use modelling that was provided by Our Watch in 2019 to say, we haven't achieved what we set out to achieve, and do not expect to see any rates of violence go down until we change these social conditions, which is 10 years at the very least. And for me, I was like, but there's things we can do now, right? Like, we need to hold government to account for reducing violence. We can't say in some time over the rainbow, when we reach this sort of utopian place post-patriarchy, we'll see violence rates reduce. That's not good enough, because who's responsible then? Who is accountable? How do we even know that's been reached? Because I don't think the National Community Attitude Survey tells us enough whether we've achieved what we need to achieve, because we've seen the youth attitudes improve over time, and yet the Australian Child Maltreatment Study shows that the youngest cohort in that study, 16 to 24, the most common sex offender against them was another adolescent known to them. So, and that has increased. So adolescent sexual perpetration against other under 18s has increased while their attitudes have improved across the board. So for me at that time and since, I mean, a lot of these conversations were held in private, and, you know, Mike and myself talked privately to Paddy Kinnersley at Our Watch about our concerns. And I didn't want to bring this out into public because I wanted to be able to just have these conversations in-house. But then when it's like we're going into another national plan and we haven't really grappled with why the first one failed, and we've got a few extra add-ons, but really nothing fundamentally different except for the add-on of recovery and healing, and yet still things like alcohol, things like intergenerational transmission of violence, they're still, you know, not present enough in the national plan. Alcohol is mentioned very passingly, hardly at all. But there are things we could be doing in the meantime while we chip away at these attitudes, instead of saying we need to put so much of our emphasis onto changing these social conditions and doing so with the old means, like using our spheres of influence, like television, you know, or media reporting, sporting clubs, schools, etc. But knowing that in the last few years, especially, our norms are being set in a sphere of influence that is essentially lawless, in which our violence prevention messaging just does not show up. You know, and it's like the levers we have on culture are so much less effective than they were in 2010, when you could say, we're going to train journalists how to report more responsibly, we're going to go to sporting clubs, we're going to do this stuff in schools, and your sphere of influence was pretty local, you know, and your parents and all the rest of it, all of that was very important. But there was this sense that we could get in and we could almost engineer something. I feel like that's completely gone. I don't know how you socially engineer something now with a globally connected world. And I don't feel like we've grappled with that change in online connectivity and what that's actually meant for this project. And so I guess what I think is missing at the end of my half-hour spiel, what I think is missing is that, to bring it back to basics, we have a framework that sets out for gendered drivers, gender inequality, harmful rigid gender norms, violence condoning attitudes, etc., as the top line and most important thing to shift. And they are separate from what are called the reinforcing factors, which are things like harmful alcohol use, things that weaken pro-social behaviour, which, sublined by like socioeconomic inequality, gambling, etc., backlash, and general violence condoning attitudes. I don't think things like child maltreatment and alcohol should be subordinated. And the impact of subordinating those reinforcing factors as a secondary influence to the four gendered drivers is that in practice, whether it was intended or not, in practice, those approaches have been sidelined and to a large extent invisibilised.
Thanks, Jess. And we'll have the opportunity in the last 10 or 15 minutes for you to ask questions of Jess as well. So if that brought up any questions for you, please, keep them in mind for then. There's something you touch on in this quarterly essay, and I've heard you speak about in other forums on the ABC, and I think you've probably written about it. I hope I haven't imagined that, but you've talked specifically about She's Not Your Rehab and other, similar groups. And you highlight the power of that work. What makes their approach, or that approach as, done by others in a similar way, different from mainstream prevention? And do you think that as a result, it speaks to the fact that perhaps mainstream campaigns are failing to connect with men as a broad group?
So I think, like I talk about in the quarterly, that I felt sometimes when I was watching prevention ads, especially those that kind of like encouraged like bystander intervention and those sorts of things, that the more that I learnt about perpetration and the nature of it, and particularly learning about things like humiliated fury and the role that shame can play, particularly in the perpetration of family violence and intimate partner violence, sometimes the prevention advertising would alarm me. And one example that I go to in the quarterly is from Victoria, so keeping it local. And it was an ad that was essentially set in a pub, and the main our protagonist, Jono, he gets a call, and he's sitting there with his friends, and he's like, "Oh, righto, it's Deb." Proceeds to have this conversation with Deb, which is degrading and all those things that you overhear as a concerned friend, and it makes you worried about your friend and what he might be doing to his partner. Things like, I told you, I only gave you this amount of money for this week, or I told you not to do that, these sorts of statements. And his friends are looking really uncomfortable, and then, he hangs up the phone, and one of them just gently admonishes him, and Jono's like, "It's just a joke." And then the other one's like, "It's not a joke, man." And then they all look into their beers. And I remember thinking, all right, Jono, you seem like a pretty insecure dude. And your friends have just sort of admonished you, but there's been no opportunity taken to be like, "Hey, Jono, we really like you, man. You're a good friend of ours. What's going on there? That's pretty off behaviour." It's just like, "Jono, man, that's not on. Go to silence, fade out." And my concern was, watching that, my real concern was, if Jono's a real guy, is he going back and taking that humiliation back to his partner? Because I worry for his partner after that happens, because there's been no containment and no sense of connection. So I ran this live experiment in 2020 under lockdown conditions when I was on a Zoom call with men in a men's behaviour change program, and I played the ad for them, and I just wanted to see what would they say about it. And one guy, Tyrone, who I talk about a bit in the essay, grew up with, horrendous domestic violence, still remembers age 4 having his, hand slammed in a door and his stepfather just shooting daggers at him and being like, you don't cry. Like, so this guy, very walled up, but had been in the behaviour change program for 2 years. And he was like, I said, Tyrone, how would you have responded to that? And he said, well, if I'd seen that 4 years ago, I'd have been like, nobody fucking tells me what to do with my missus. I'll fucking tell my missus whatever I want to fucking tell them. Like, thanks for your input, Tyrone. And then I went to this other guy who was more thoughtful and empathetic
Probably
than
not
Tyrone.
hard after Tyrone's sort of, to be thoughtful and empathetic.
Well, but to their credit, they actually were quite honest and,
Yes,
engaging with each other. And this guy was much more coming from this position, which was a little bit more sort of like sympathetic to the position of abuser than I was. But it was more sort of like pretty much saying like, if this guy is experiencing internal suffering or humiliation or whatever, does this just exacerbate it? And like, yes, it's right to stigmatise that behaviour and make it out of line, and that's an important thing for society to do. But where are the role models who are like, I've been through really tough shit as well, and here's how I got through that? Rather than, I'm just like a big shiny like football captain and you should all be more like me because I am like the shining star of masculinity. Because that's, for a lot of these guys, it's like, that's just intimidating and makes me feel like shit because I can't ever be like that. And what really struck me about, She Is Not Your Rehab, I've been in touch with for many years and they've really been getting a larger footprint in Australia, which is fantastic, is that they had this campaign recently, Not All Men. And at first when they said they were going to do this campaign and call it Not All Men, I was like, are you sure? Anyway, but their whole thing was, it's very simple, and it was promoting their Inner Boy app, which is like a 30-day self-guided program to basically help men who are never going to go to therapy and probably won't go to a men's behaviour change program, at least not in the short term, help them learn how to almost retrain their nervous systems. And it's guided by Matt Brown, who comes from, an unbelievable background of family violence, but is now the most gentle, cheeky and incredible guy leading this anti-violence movement with his wife. And their slogans were like, not all men heal, will you? Not all men break cycles, will you? And their ambassadors, part of like their ambassadorship is to be like, I went through this as a kid and it took so much to retrain my nervous system or to learn how to not react in the moment, and it's like these imperfect male ambassadors who can help guide and show a path out of where they are, but also give them something to do, like something that will help them modify their behaviour, rather than just, these are messages that we think you should be cogitating and taking on board, which even if they were to change their attitude and think, yeah, violence is wrong, a lot of violence happens in the exceptions. It's like, oh, you should never be violent against women. But like my ex-girlfriend, what she did to me, so I guess what I love about She Is Not Your Rehab is that they are coming from this position of imperfection and showing guys a pathway out of their reactivity, and also acknowledging, that this is not just like we go from, flipping a switch to like toxic masculinity, positive masculinity. And it's just, you can just like take a t-shirt off and put a positive masculinity t-shirt on and like Bob's your uncle. It's like, this is hard work. You probably have to go into some places that feel really fucking painful, and the little live demonstration that they did for myself and these community leaders, these Aboriginal and Pacifica leaders in Campbelltown for 3 hours, they put us through our paces. We went into such dark territory and we're like hugging and crying, and it was just like, it was so intense. And I thought, this is genius because it is showing you in real time, this is what it takes, right? It takes this, but it takes this over years. And this is the sort of work that we want to avoid. So how do we pitch to these guys? You should not just take the easy option, use coercive control or use sexual violence or whatever gives you that sense of power in the moment where you can avoid any feelings of being shamed or unloved and just take control over your intimate relationships. How do we say to them, you should do the hard work over years to unpick all of those responses and be a better partner?
Jess, you've just talked, about this idea of like, I guess, shifting away from purely blame to accountability, healing. But, I'm sure many here today have either already binged Adolescence on Netflix or are partway through it, or have seen the countless social media posts about it and wondering, what is that about? It is the most watched show on Netflix Australia for the past 2 weeks or 3 weeks. When we talk about things like whether it's She's Not Your Rehab and the Inner Boy app, we are confronted with, as we are in the program, the idea that boys are being radicalized in as you term it, a lawless environment, an unregulated environment, at in a way where we're not even privy to what's happening in their digital worlds necessarily. And before they've had a relationship or any kind of meaningful interaction with a person of the same or different sex or gender. And so I guess that raises questions about whether the algorithm is more powerful than any prevention campaign we could possibly conduct. But also, what do we do? What do we do in this world? I'm sure there are parents here or educators or those who work with young people thinking, how the hell do I get through to young people? How do I connect with them in a way that doesn't alienate or push them further into that online vortex and that algorithm? Because it is, whether we like it or not, it is one of the most biggest and pressing issues of our time. And it seems like there's always a hot take, but very few people know what to do.
Yes. So I'm not going to just offer another hot take, so I'll just give I don't know, hot droppings or whatever, just bits and pieces. I'm using a lot of poo references and that's not my usual way. So I don't know if there's a vibe in the room.
Imperfect, it's imperfect.
So I think firstly, we have to be careful that we don't err into feeling like we have to tiptoe around these boys, and that if we call them out for their bad behaviour, we're going to just drive them, further into the arms of radical influencers, because a big part of this is a lack of, accountability is an overused word, but if you're in a school situation, you saw with Yarra Valley Grammar, it was actually we need to prioritise the girls' safety in this moment. That's actually the most important part. And I think in all of the analysis of adolescence, and let's be clear, this is a drama series. It is not a public service announcement, and it is not supposed to be calibrated to all of the right, things that we would put, all the ingredients that we put into our perfect public service announcement. But it has come at a zeitgeist time where people are concerned about growing social isolation of boys. So it's obvious it's hit such a nerve, and it's great to see people sort of spitballing about what it means. I think there's a few things to say. I don't think that we're lacking good male role models, like yourself, Tarang, who is active on Instagram and in people's algorithms. But they don't get elevated by the algorithm. They don't cause people to have reactions. So they're not going to be platformed in this world as much as your take copycats and all the rest of it who generate outrage. That's what the algorithm is, an outrage machine. So that's one thing. The other thing is to say that if we knew how to prevent violence among young people, then we would probably be doing it. The issue is not that young people are violent towards each other. They always have been and they always will be. Sorry. Because this is the highest risk age group for sexual violence. The highest risk age group for intimate partner violence is 15 to 19, right? So we're always going to be dealing with a disproportionately, high rates of violence in this age group. The problem that's really is one of the people who speaks in the essay talks about, the problem that's hidden in plain sight is we don't know how to prevent it. We don't even really know how to respond to it properly. And part of so when we talk about respectful relationships education in schools, for example, and one thing that I wasn't able to include in the essay because this is the longest essay that's ever been written. And it's the longest quarterly essay ever, I was told. And the second longest was also written by me, just saying. So I can't be brief, as you probably all picked up on.
Do you need a new editor, perhaps?
Yeah,
Yes? No.
I have an editor. He's just very nice and permissive. So the thing that we couldn't include was that, you know, when you look at respectful relationships education, and we've had it for 10 years in Victoria, the evaluations don't say, hey, look, you know, this is how the attitudes are changing in a positive direction. They don't even actually say this is how the attitudes are not changing or the problems that we're having. We don't actually have data on how students' attitudes are changing at all. It's just quite sort of generic motherhood statements in those evaluations, like it seems that students' attitudes are a little harder to shift than teachers' attitudes, which have changed, and there's data for that. And also it seems that secondary school students' attitudes are a little harder to shift than primary school students. And it's like, well, anyone with kids would be like, well, yeah, you try shifting a 13-year-old's attitudes. So there's that. So we're not sure at the moment whether respectful relationships education changes attitudes in secondary school students for the better, whether those changed attitudes leads to improved behaviour, whether it leads to reduced perpetration or victimisation. We are just not transparently evaluating this education.
So does that mean don't do it, or do continue doing it but do better evaluation?
Definitely do better evaluation, because we could be having a boomerang effect among some young men, particularly who may be more prone to violence, and their attitudes may be hardening, and in fact their behaviour may be hardening as a result. We don't know. That is a risk, though, that's been observed internationally. But so the part that I didn't get to include was one of the best things that comes from respectful relationships education is that actually young people learn that they've experienced abuse or their friends experiencing abuse. They learn what abuse looks like so that in the future they may more readily recognise it. And early disclosure, when you're talking about a life trajectory, that is so important. For me personally, that would be enough to run respectful relationships education in every school. Whether or not it prevents perpetration is secondary to interrupting that life, like silence that can go on for decades and lead to lots of very bad outcomes. But given that we know the absolute guaranteed outcome of respectful relationships education is increased disclosure, and we're about to introduce this all across Australia, how are schools equipped to deal with these disclosures? What happens when a victim survivor alleges sexual assault from another student? Does the school have a way to respond? Is anyone overseeing that? Because if you disclose, and you've been encouraged to disclose by the educators who are teaching you, and then you get a response which is basically like, we wish we could help, this is very bad, but we can't actually do anything to make you safer. And in fact, you're probably going to have to look after your own safety. Now, I'm not saying that that is the response in Victoria, and some Victorian schools are fantastic and they are ahead of other schools around the country. But we haven't even considered that for the states and territories that are about to roll this out to. And I feel like that is so negligent for what those students need. And I feel like we've had this sort of approach to respectful relationships education, like what we need is just more education. We need more education, and education is just sort of, as I say in the essay, it's just a benign product, the more the better. And in fact, actually, research shows that's not the case. And as I said, sometimes you get hardened attitudes in response. And we have a review that was commissioned by the federal government that La Trobe University did about sexual violence prevention, and they're like, we couldn't find one paper in Australia that showed us a sexual violence program that was working to prevent violence. So there's a whole bunch of programs that are working that don't have a known evidence base behind them, and that's a concern for government now. And weirdly, and this is so awkward to bring up, and every time I've brought it up, people have groaned. So you can groan, but I'm expecting it.
Let's see if we're any different here
Let's
now.
have a groanometer. Is that one of the only programs that La Trobe found from internationally that reduced sexual violence was a program that was not directed at men, but directed at women, at young women in college. And it was an empowering program which was all about educating them and overturning the myths they had in their mind about who they were most vulnerable to, like stranger danger stuff. You're most vulnerable to men you know, not just intimate partners, but friends also. Also empowering them to know that alcohol is often used to facilitate assault. If he's like actively getting you drunk, that's maybe a red flag. Also to say, here are some physical and verbal strategies to resist if you are in danger of being assaulted. Now, the woman who developed this is a total dead set feminist. She's not coming at this saying, well, it's women's responsibility to stop them being raped, you know, or saying that if you don't use those strategies and you end up being raped, that's on you. Her point was like, let's keep trying to develop these programs, but given that at the moment they seem to have minimal to no effect on young men who rape, we need to arm young women with some strategies to try to protect themselves in the moment. And they had a 50% reduction in sexual violence for the women who went through these programs. Now, the response to that usually, and the Groaner meter was very quiet tonight, so thanks.
I think we're waiting for you to finish.
Internalized groans. But the response is usually to something like this and to self-defense classes and all these sorts of things is like, why don't we just teach men not to rape? And the fact is, we can want to have all these things and we can want to have the facts as we want them, but we also have to just make friends with reality and have the facts as they are and work from that basis and create safety where safety can be created. And the last thing that I'll say on this, and I promise I'll shut up and let you ask another question, is that one of the only school programs that showed results in a much larger meta-review that was also called a damning wake-up call around our reliance on certain education methods was this thing called shifting boundaries. And it was funny, they tried to use another successful program, Safe Dates, and use, a variety of the methods they used for that. And the classroom learning actually had no impact on perpetration. What did have an impact was changing the context. So they brought in where there were hotspots around I think it was the schools. They brought in more faculty to be in those hotspots for sexual harassment and sexual assault. They did things like they introduced building level intervention orders where there were allegations levelled. They reviewed their protocols for responding to disclosures. That was what drove perpetration down. And it's not to say that you shouldn't have the classroom learning as well. You absolutely should. As I said, there's so many benefits to that. But sometimes we need to think more about changing the context, not just the greater population-wide social context, but the actual lived reality context that students are operating in to deter these sorts of things from occurring.
I'm really glad that when you referenced that program, Jess, that you did cover that the person behind it is a staunch, she is a staunch feminist, etc. Because I think, perhaps the groan or lack of is that sort of visceral, hang on a minute, isn't that the men's rights argument, or isn't that the victim blaming and lack of accountability for men, that it seems like successive waves of the feminist movement, which have championed women's rights and equality, despite all of the progress, still are not where we'd like them to be, because women it's still upon them to protect themselves in some way from rape and sexual assault and sexual violence, and the men get off somehow scot-free without any blame or any accountability.
Well, that part should definitely change. Just saying, that part of getting off scot-free is separate, but I think, and the fact that so many men, as you say, do get off scot-free, that's a big part of it. There's not a lot of deterrent, right? I think that generally speaking, we have to do the best in the context in which we're in, and then we need to keep working and developing and evaluating things so we can see how we might actually take that weight off women and girls.
Jess, you draw this really stark contrast, and not for the first time in the quarterly, between the deaths of white women, the killings of white women and Aboriginal women. And also you draw attention to the experience more broadly of First Nations women, disabled women, migrant women, and also children and young people is something that you've been speaking about extensively for some time now, like prior to just this quarterly. What do we need to do in terms of a national strategy or in terms of media accountability to reshape that narrative, change that conversation? Because often it is the lives of the, and very tragically, but the lives of the young, conventionally attractive, able-bodied white woman who is recognised in terms of any kind of men's violence as a victim, and others are relegated, particularly children and young people as primary victims in their own right. What needs to change?
Yeah, well, it'd be great if we could wave a magic wand and, change culture as it is. I think that, I'm pretty sure from memory it was Celeste Little, the Arende writer, who said that Aboriginal women's deaths are expected. It doesn't feel like news when it happens. And the murder of middle class, particularly young white women, is not expected. And particularly the perpetration from often middle class, maybe attractive men is also not expected. I was thinking about this a lot just in the context of the inquest that's going on into the just absolutely horrific murder of Lily James, and also just to foreground this with, I really don't like pitting dead women against each other, to be honest.
No, that's not the intention.
No, and that's not, I know it's not, obviously not your intention, Tarang. I'm saying it's actually more of a sense, I just don't want that to come across like that in discussing this and bringing Lily's name into it. But I was thinking about the other factors, aside from the ones that I've just mentioned, and also that, there was a great article in the Guardian by Carla Brown and Dr. Che Brown up in the Northern Territory, and they talked about the fact that when 3 women were killed in the town of Ballarat, it sort of caused this national outrage and Victorian funding to fall into place, and quite rightly. But then when 3 women were killed in the town of Katherine with 10,000 people in it, it barely raised any media attention at all. Now, there is all those elements in it, but there are the elements of when these things happen closer to capital cities, there's just the fact that there are more journalists in the vicinity. Sometimes this is like a logistical issue. That's not the main reason. There's also the fact that when you think about the deaths or the murders that have received a lot of media attention and have been like these watershed moments, and think about the murder of Hannah Clark and her 3 children, think about the murder of Luke Batty, think about the murder of Lily James. In all of those cases, the perpetrator suicided at the scene or after. And there's a thing in journalism which is called sub judice. And you can't really report in detail on an alleged murder when the charges have been laid. You have to be really careful about what you say before a court case occurs. When the perpetrator is dead, journalists have pretty much free rein to report whatever they want and report the fullness of the story, and do that at the moment when the shock is there. So I think there are some reasons, aside from what I mentioned up front, that certain cases end up having this kind of impact. Because there's more access for journalists to go in and report it. And sometimes... Is
that everything though? Sorry, I mean, isn't there an element of race and power dynamics 100%.
There? As I said, that's what Celeste talks about. Aboriginal women are expected to be killed. That is the primary reason why they don't get their deaths reported on. But I was just thinking about those added things, like the calculations that journalists make about whether things go... whether we have big investigations into various things. I mean, the other calculation is they imagine, rightly or wrongly, their readership to be white and middle class, and they key into the concerns that readership has about their daughter or son or sister or brother being killed in this way, and it sells newspapers.
As an aside, that's probably the best critiques of adolescence that I've seen recently is that it's been grounded in this idea that it can happen to us. And by us, it means white working class families, or at least the depiction of them, as opposed to it's the thing that happens over there. They wouldn't necessarily make a drama that depicts violence in that particular way, or if a young boy of color or a young girl of color are victims of violence, that it's, as you say in Celeste's words, it's expected that Aboriginal women will die. Not that it's wanted or warranted in any way whatsoever, but the expectation is, well, of course they're going to succumb to male violence in some way. We've got, I've got so many questions that I could ask you. I want to ask one more before we open to the audience for audience questions. An hour really isn't long enough. I want to ask a question about what systems can learn from victim survivor advocates that they're currently ignoring.
Well, I mean, we could go to what the Victorian government is currently ignoring by introducing bail laws that are going to disproportionately target young Aboriginal people and cancelling funding for crime prevention programs that are working with young people at the same time. I think.
But can't we arrest our way out of this crisis?
Yeah, that's right. And particularly the younger the better, I think. Send a strong message. So the issue is, so we've had, obviously, I mean, survivor advocates and their families like yourself, Tarang, like over the last, really over the last 10 years particularly, have increased in volume and influence. And that's been really important for grounding policy responses better in the needs and wants of victim survivors. Children and young people haven't had that same access to a microphone because a lot of journalists are very nervous about interviewing children, so we've only it's a really burgeoning area, having these young people advocate. But what I think we're starting to hear from young people and young people who've aged out of the various systems is about how the systems that have maybe been seen as peripheral to family violence, like child protection, youth detention, less so family law, are absolutely central to their experience. And I think that, there's been enormous advocacy around child protection and youth detention from Aboriginal organisations, from children's commissioners, but not so much from the family violence sector. And when we're talking about broadening the prevention approach, when you're removing children into out-of-home care, into situations that too often may be even more unsafe than the situation they were removed from, if the situation they were removed from even was unsafe, and that's debatable in a number of cases, you are literally making it more likely that that child is going to be victimised as a child, potentially by their carer or by other people who exploit them, or go on to perpetrate violence later in life. This is not separate. Child protection and youth detention and what we do to kids through these systems is not separate to how we intervene and how we prevent family violence and other forms of gendered violence. And I guess my desire, I feel like we'll know things have moved when you see an announcement like Victoria's bail laws and you see the family violence sector kick into gear in the same way that they would if they heard that funding for refuges was being cut, where they say children have been recognised as victims in their own right. In the national plan, we as governments have committed to ending violence against them within a single generation. It is an own goal and completely against our own commitments to subject children to state-sanctioned violence. That is what everybody has to stand up for.
Thank you, Jess. Jess, I could ask you, a million questions, get a million responses, and then probably have a million more questions for you. But it's not about me. So I want to open up to the audience. We've only got a few minutes of questions. I'm hoping we've got some. I can see some Wheeler Centre staff who have a microphone. I think there might be someone at the front with their hand up. And I will ask that I'm not afraid of going Q&A circa 2013 and doing the Tony Jones. I'll take that as a comment. So if we can please keep our questions short and sharp and concise as actual questions for Jess, so that we can hear from more people.
My name's Katrina. Myself and my daughter have been victims of family violence for 14 years. We've been going through the family court for 14 years. The experiences that we've been subjected to have been repeatedly and consistently minimised, dismissed, ignored. It seems that no matter what evidence I bring before the court or have brought before the court, it has been ignored, minimised, dismissed, and the perpetration of abuse of my daughter's father has been protected. She was taken out of my care in August 22. This seems to be an issue which is not just affecting me, but affecting many people, people around me, people that I've learnt about in the enormous amount of research that I've done, especially since my daughter was taken. And what we have witnessed and experienced, and what I've learnt is very common, is the difficulties faced with trying to seek help for family violence perpetration. Once the family court is involved, it seems that child protection don't want to get involved, that the police don't want to get involved, and yet the family court are waiting for recognition of evidence or evidence from those systems, while at the same time those systems are not wanting to intervene because they're saying, well, this is before the family law court, so we'll leave it to them. And for those exact reasons, we've been stuck in this situation for 14 years with horrific events last year in particular, and other people around me are going through similar things where there is a clear perpetrator of abuse. It's being ignored in the family court, and then going through the magistrates court with interventions orders, you know, the whole gamut, and yet it is held in place by the family law court. The perpetration of abuse is held in place. So I just wondered what your thoughts were on this subject. Thank you.
Well, I mean, first of all, that's just such a shattering experience to go through. And I'm so sorry. It's like, I think for a number of mothers, so many mothers actually, I've lost count, and their kids, it's like going through the looking glass, you know, and it's like, how did we end up here in like sort of upside down world where there's so many different expectations. I was supposed to leave because otherwise then, you know, maybe child protection would get involved and say, I'm not protecting my kid. So I left. Now family court's saying, well, I have to, you know, give some access to the father, otherwise I look like I'm alienating my kid from him. And it's just like these completely at odds systems that are they're pushing and pulling you in all sorts of different directions. You know, there's been, the Albanese government was courageous, I think, to change the Family Law Act and manage to slip that past the fathers' rights groups kind of in the dead of night to overturn the presumption of equal shared parenting. What we have learnt, though, over time is that changing legislation is not enough to change culture, and the intersection of those systems, as you've said, it's like they wipe their hands of it once in the family court. We know from the court's own data that over 80% of cases that make it to a full hearing have family violence allegations, and yet it is not a family violence court. It is not a court that understands how to adjudicate allegations of child sexual abuse. I think at the moment the inordinate amount of power that's invested in single expert report writers who submit the report to the court and whose evidence has an enormous amount of weight, one person who's often paid $20,000 or more, is just it can't work, and it doesn't work. And we should be having impartial experts and probably a triage process of assessment where you're actually getting people with expertise in child development and child sexual abuse, if that's the case, or family violence, to be assessing these cases. Because at the moment, when kids are ordered into the custody, as you have horribly discovered through, you know, being initiated into this system, they don't get to just call police when they're being abused and then get out of it. When they run, the custodial parent can literally lodge a recovery order with the court and have them pursued by the Australian Federal Police. I'm so sorry. It's a national shame that that's happening. And I think that one day those kids are going to come out and they're going to say, screw section 121 that says I'm not allowed to talk about my case. and there's going to be probably compensation claims.
Thank you, Katrina, and I echo what Jess said. I'm so sorry for the awfulness that you've endured and continue to endure. We've probably got time for one more question before we move to book signings. I can see someone's hand up in the front, and for those who aren't able to ask now, I'm sure that you'll get an opportunity during the book signings to be able to have a conversation with Jess as well.
Hi, Jess. I just wanted to ask a question about if you have up-to-date, I know you're all over the statistics, so do you have any up-to-date information about the percentage of people who are both perpetrators and victims of domestic violence who are adults who also had experiences of domestic violence as children?
I wish we did have updated statistics that would give us a really good coverage of that. At the moment, you know, we've got some indication, say, for example, through the Pathways to Homicide research that 𝐒𝐨𝐫𝐞 led, that excluded situations in which the perpetrator was killed at the time, or, you know, with a suicidal lethal intervention at the time of the murder. But basically, at least over 50% of those perpetrators had significant childhood trauma histories. And this is what we know from court records, etc. The rest is what we know kind of from anecdotally and from people who work with men and men who show up in men's behaviour change programs, men in prisons. I mean, but the fact that we don't actually have that data at this point into the second national plan is really telling about our lack of official curiosity into what is backgrounding perpetration. So at the moment, we just have a basic acceptance among people who work with men who use violence and coercive control that trauma is just a constant. It's not that every perpetrator has had a background of childhood trauma, and it's not uniform. It's just that it's so common to be almost like a trope, and that victim survivors, when they are surveyed, will often talk about the trauma histories of their partners and how obliged they felt to stay and help them address that and help them find that shamed and scared little boy inside of them and convince that little boy that he could be loved. And in the meantime, the man often did not pursue his own healing and used horrific levels of manipulation to get the kinds of power and control that he needed to feel safe or to feel, dominant. So that's the long answer. The short answer is no, we don't have those statistics.
And ultimately, I suppose, Jess, the corollary of all that is that women and children predominantly pay the price of that man's adulthood choices, or lack of desire or will to do anything about it. Jess, we could continue this conversation well into the night, but we do have to honour how long we have this space for. Fearless work is so crucial in terms of trying to eradicate the scourge of men's violence against women and children in this country. This was a riveting read. I didn't know until you told me now, and all of us, that it's the longest, or that you have the two longest quarterly essays in history. But I think that's testament to just how complex and layered this particular issue is. If there was one quick fix, I'm sure we'd have done it already. I'm sure that the women's safety sector as a whole would have put themselves out of work quite gladly, and we'd have a world where women and children are safe. Thank you for writing this, for the work that you put into it, and for everything that you continue to do. I also want to thank all of you for attending here this evening at the Wheeler Centre, and thank the bookseller Sun Bookshop. They will have copies of Jess's quarterly essay, Losing It, as well as copies of her book, See What You Made Me Do, at the back of the room. And then Jess will be doing book signings upstairs. So please follow Wheeler Centre ushers for further directions. I've been your host for this evening, Tarang Chawla. It's been delightful to join you as well, Jess. Thank you so much, and hope to see you again at the Wheeler Centre soon.
Thank you so much, Tarang. Thank you.